The wind, a merciless sculptor, had scoured the plains for days, leaving behind a world etched in frigid white and skeletal branches. Under a sky the color of bruised plums, two small figures huddled, indistinguishable from the gnarled stumps of sagebrush, save for the faint tremor that shook their forms. Alara, 9 years old, pressed her face into the scratchy wool of her sister's coat, inhaling the stale scent of desperation and unwashed fabric. Beside her, Isla, twin and anchor, drew ragged breaths, her small, round face already tinged blue, lips cracked and peeling. Their stepfather, a man whose kindness had evaporated with their mother's last breath, had driven them out to this desolate stretch of Wyoming and simply left them with 2 threadbare blankets, a half-eaten loaf of stale bread, and the chilling promise of rescue that never came. Days had blurred into an eternity of hunger, cold, and a fear so profound it tasted like ash in Alara's mouth. Their bodies, accustomed to the soft comforts of too much food and too little movement, felt impossibly heavy, yet utterly hollow. Every movement was an effort, every breath a shallow struggle against the icy air that clawed at their lungs. Alara's mind, usually buzzing with the mundane joys of childhood, was now a desolate landscape mirroring their surroundings, punctuated only by the desperate need for warmth and the terrifying absence of a future. She remembered the plumpness of their cheeks, the rolls of fat that had been a testament to her mother's anxious affection, now a cruel burden, demanding energy their starved bodies couldn't provide. This vast, unforgiving land, indifferent to their plight, seemed to stretch into infinity, a bleak canvas for their vanishing hope. Isla stirred, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Alara instinctively tightened her hold, a fierce, primal protectiveness rising within her. They were all they had left. "Hold on, Isla," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, thin as spider silk. "Someone will come. They have to," but the silence that answered her was vast and cold, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind. Panic, a cold, sharp blade, pricked at her. What if no one came? What if they were meant to simply disappear? The thought was unbearable, a horror more profound than the cold. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to conjure the image of a warm fire, a full belly, the gentle curve of her mother's smile. But the memories were faint, distant echoes in the storm of their present misery. Then a flicker, a distant, almost imperceptible shadow against the fading light. Alara forced her heavy eyelids open, squinting. It was too far, too indistinct to be anything but a trick of the exhausted mind, a cruel mirage. Yet, the shadow grew, slow and deliberate, taking on the unmistakable shape of a man on horseback. Her heart, a frozen lump in her chest, began to beat with a frantic, desperate rhythm. Fear and a fragile thread of hope tangled within her. What kind of man would be out in this desolation? This land was known for its hardened souls, its solitary figures, its unspoken rules. Would he see them as a burden, a nuisance, or something worse? Her breath hitched. The horse's hooves broke the silence, crunching softly on the frozen ground, drawing nearer. Alara watched, a tiny, shivering sentinel in a world that had forgotten them, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider, whose silhouette now dominated the horizon, a stark, imposing figure against the bleak canvas of the dying day. The rider, a man weathered and stoic, dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the 2 small, huddled forms. Caleb Stone, his own life a testament to loss, understood the raw language of desolation. His wife and child taken by the fever years ago, he'd built a silent existence in the shadow of grief, his ranch his only companion. He knelt, his movements unhurried, revealing a face etched with the lines of hard living and quiet sorrow. Alara flinched, pulling Isla closer, a tiny, defiant gesture. Caleb said nothing, his eyes, the color of winter skies, taking in their pinched faces, their chapped lips, the unnatural bulk of their 2 large clothes that only emphasized their growing gauntness. He saw not the obese children implied by their former lives, but 2 small, fragile birds, starved and frozen, perched precariously on the edge of oblivion. He extended a gloved hand, not to touch them, but to offer a simple, worn leather canteen. Alara eyed it suspiciously, then looked at Isla, who was barely conscious. Her own throat was a desert, but a lifetime of caution, taught by a mother who knew the world's sharp edges, held her back. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a reedy whisper. "Where is he?" Caleb remained silent for a moment, letting the vast quiet of the plains answer for him. "No one's coming for you, girl," he said, his voice low, gravelly, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. "Not out here." The words, blunt and without malice, settled heavy in the air. Alara's fragile hope shattered, leaving behind a cold, sharp shard of despair. But then he added, "I'll take you to my place. Warmth. Food." He gestured vaguely north, towards a cluster of pines barely visible in the fading light. It was not a question, but a quiet command, delivered without expectation. There was no warmth in his tone, no discernible kindness, yet his eyes, though grave, held no threat. It was a simple offer of survival, devoid of sentiment. Alara, desperate, looked at Isla's pale face, then back at the man. Necessity was a cruel master. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of her head. Caleb moved with surprising gentleness, first lifting Isla, who was limp and unresponsive, then Alara. Their weight, though still considerable from their past overfeeding, felt strangely light in his arms, the lightness of near starvation. He settled them both on his horse, wrapping them in his own thick, wool blanket, its scent of wood smoke and leather a strange comfort against the biting wind. The journey to his cabin was a blurred agony of cold and exhaustion for the girls. The cabin, small and rough-hewn, was a haven from the biting wind. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The aroma of wood smoke and something savory simmering in a pot filled the air, a scent so rich, so alien to their starved senses. It made Alara's stomach clench painfully. Caleb settled them by the fire, then set about preparing a thin, nourishing broth. He spoke little, his movements economical, purposeful. He brought them 2 chipped ceramic mugs, filled with the warm liquid. Alara took a tentative sip, the warmth spreading through her, a lifeline. Isla, still weak, had to be coaxed, but she too eventually drank. As they slowly sipped, Alara watched him. His hands, gnarled and strong, moved with a quiet competence that spoke of a lifetime spent mastering his environment. He was an enigma, this man who had saved them without a word of explanation or expectation, his presence as solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. He was a stone in the river of their despair, a silent, unexpected anchor. Days bled into a measured routine. Caleb, a man of few words, let his actions speak. He provided food simple, wholesome fare, stew, hardtack, dried fruit. Not the sugary treats or rich pastries they had once known, but sustenance that slowly, steadily, nursed their bodies back from the brink. The girls, initially suspicious, watched him with wide, wary eyes. Isla, the more reserved of the two, clung to Alara, her trust a fragile thing. Alara, ever the protector, remained vigilant, her senses acutely tuned to his every movement, every shift in the air. Their past lives, marked by the constant presence of a mother whose anxiety often manifested in overfeeding, felt like a distant, hazy dream. Here, the silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, or the occasional soft creak of the cabin. Their bodies, accustomed to a life of sedentary comfort, began to shed the excesses of their past. The arduous journey, the sparse diet, and the sheer effort of existing in such a stark environment slowly whittled away their former size. Their cheeks became less round, their limbs leaner, their movements less cumbersome. They were still big for their age, but the unhealthy puffiness that had defined them was receding, replaced by a nascent strength. They didn't understand the science, only that they felt lighter, more agile, less burdened. This physical transformation was, in a quiet way, a liberation. No longer weighed down by the remnants of their former, anxious existence, they began to move with a newfound, tentative freedom. Caleb, observing them with his silent gaze, never commented on their size, past or present. He merely ensured they ate enough that they were warm. He taught them small tasks: how to chop kindling, how to feed the chickens, how to mend a tear in their clothes. His patience was boundless, his expectations clear. He didn't coddle. He simply offered the tools of survival. Alara, through diligent observation, began to learn his rhythms. The precise way he chopped wood, the quiet care he took tending to his single, scrawny milk cow, the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he thought no one was watching. He would leave them alone for hours, venturing out to check traps or gather supplies, and they would wait, a silent, unspoken trust solidifying between them. One bitterly cold morning, Alara found him struggling with a frozen pump. His breath plumed in the frigid air, his hands, usually so strong, fumbling with the stubborn mechanism. Without a word, she knelt beside him, her smaller fingers surprisingly adept at working the stiff latch he couldn't quite reach with his gloved hands. He paused, looking at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. She didn't look up, concentrating on the task. The pump gave a groan, then a trickle, then a gush of icy water. He nodded once, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement that felt like a profound approval. That night, as she lay on her straw pallet, Alara realized they were no longer just survivors in his care. They were part of his world, however small their contribution. The cabin, once a place of refuge, was beginning to feel like a home, held together not by blood, but by shared silence and unspoken understanding. A bond forged in the crucible of necessity and quiet, unassuming care. As winter deepened, so too did the silent bond within the small cabin. Alara and Isla, no longer ghosts haunting Caleb's solitary existence, began to bloom in the austere environment. Their bodies, stripped of the excess that had once defined them, were growing leaner, stronger, their movements more purposeful. The unhealthy pallor of their skin had given way to a healthy flush from the cold and the sparse, active life. They helped Caleb with chores without being asked, anticipating his needs. Isla, once almost entirely reliant on Alara, would now brave the chicken coop alone, returning with eggs, her face alight with pride. Alara, her mind sharper, her observations keener, learned to read the sky, to distinguish the various animal tracks in the snow, to gauge the severity of the coming weather by the way the wind whispered through the pines. Caleb, in turn, began to leave them small gifts: a carved wooden bird, a handful of polished river stones, a story whispered by the firelight, hesitant at first, then growing more confident. One afternoon, a bitter storm descended without warning, a furious whiteout that swallowed the world whole. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the cabin's very foundations, clawing at the windows, threatening to tear the roof from its moorings. Inside, the fire, usually a source of comfort, seemed small and fragile against the sheer force of the blizzard. Caleb moved with grim efficiency, boarding up the windows, checking the dwindling woodpile. Alara watched his face, the lines of worry deepening around his eyes. Their supplies were low. He had planned to go to town for provisions the next day, but the storm had pinned them down. "We'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to them, his voice tight. But Alara saw the fear in his gaze, a fleeting shadow that mirrored her own. Outside, the world was a maelstrom. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail, and the cabin groaned under its assault. Suddenly, a splintering crash rent the air, sending a shower of snow and ice through the cabin's rear wall. A large section of the log wall had given way, ripped out by a rogue gust. Frigid air, laden with snow, poured in, threatening to extinguish their last flame of hope. The cabin temperature plummeted instantly. Caleb swore, a rare, guttural sound, and rushed to assess the damage. "Too big to fix from inside," he muttered, his breath clouding. "Got to brace it from out." He grabbed his coat, an axe. Going out into that fury was near suicidal. Alara's heart seized. She remembered her mother's anxious overfeeding, a futile attempt to protect them from a world she couldn't control. Now, Caleb was walking directly into that unforgiving world. For them. Isla, her eyes wide with terror, clutched Alara's hand.
No.
Isla whispered, her small voice choked with fear. Don't go. Caleb hesitated, his gaze briefly meeting Alara's. In his eyes, she saw not only determination, but a flicker of the very same vulnerability she had come to recognize in herself. This stoic man, who had saved them, was risking everything. He turned, pulling the door open against the wind's savage push. Then Alara spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the din. Let me help. Caleb turned, surprised. There's a smaller axe in the shed, she continued, her mind racing. And some spare timbers. We can drag them to the opening. And use that old canvas tarp to patch it quick. Her voice held no plea, only a clear statement of intent, born of weeks of silent observation and a growing sense of agency. Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile child, but a fierce, capable spirit. He saw the resilience he had inadvertently fostered, reflected back at him. For the first time, he wasn't just their protector. He was part of a team. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her competence, a quiet acceptance of a shared burden. The blizzard raged, a furious, white-hot maelstrom that threatened to tear the small cabin and its occupants apart. But inside, a different kind of fire burned, the steady, defiant flame of shared purpose. Caleb worked with grim determination to clear the larger debris, while Alara and Isla, moving with a strength born of desperation, dragged timbers and the heavy canvas tarp closer. Their small hands, raw from the cold, fumbled with ropes and nails, but their focus was absolute. Alara, guiding Isla, directed the heavy tarp, her small frame straining against the wind's brutal force, trying to pull it taut over the gaping hole. The blizzard roared like a beast, snatching at the canvas, threatening to rip it from their grasp. A particularly violent gust tore the tarp, sending a section flailing wildly. Caleb, his face grim, moved to secure it, but the wind was too strong, the exposed timber too slippery with ice. Hold it! Alara yelled over the howl, surprising even herself with the force of her voice. She quickly knotted one end of a rope to a timber, tossing the other end to Isla. Tie it to the door handle. Tight! Isla, her eyes wide but determined, fumbled with the rope, her fingers numb, but she did as she was told. The rope held, securing one side of the canvas. Working together, Caleb from outside, Alara and Isla from within, they wrestled the remaining section of canvas over the breach, nailing it roughly into place. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to stem the worst of the wind and snow, to stem the cold, to give them a fighting chance. Finally, the crisis passed. The storm began to abate, its fury spent, leaving behind a world hushed and pristine under a canopy of stars. Inside the cabin, exhaustion weighed heavy, but a quiet triumph shimmered in the air. Alara and Isla, shivering but resolute, sat by the mended wall, watching Caleb. He was leaning against the hearth, his face smudged with soot and ice, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the crude patch, then at the girls. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a rare sight that transformed his stern features. It was not a smile of amusement, but of profound gratitude, of a burden shared. In the days that followed, life resumed its measured pace, but something had irrevocably shifted. The girls, once entirely dependent, now contributed meaningfully. They no longer saw themselves as helpless burdens, nor did Caleb see them that way. They were a unit, forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The physical transformation of the twins, once defined by their unhealthily large frames, was now complete. They were lithe, active, their bodies reflecting the resilience of their spirits. The faint traces of their former selves had been shed, not just in weight, but in the vulnerability that had once crippled them. They were strong, capable, and fiercely independent. Caleb, who had believed his life's purpose had ended with the loss of his family, found himself living a new one, richer than he could have ever imagined. He had saved 2 lost children, yes, but in doing so, they had unwittingly saved him. They had filled the hollow spaces in his silent home and his guarded heart with laughter, with questions, with the simple, profound joy of shared existence. He watched Alara and Isla chase each other through the first spring wildflowers, their voices light as birdsong, their steps nimble and free. He saw not just children, but the resilient spirit of the land, blossoming anew. He had found them, 2 lost girls, abandoned and despairing, and he had given them a chance at life. But they, in turn, had given him something far more precious. A future, a family, and the quiet, everyday blessing of their presence. A grace he hadn't known he needed, and now couldn't imagine living without.